Hey, you guys. Hope everyone is doing well. Welcome back. Got day 2 of developmental psychology now. So, what we're going to do today is introduce some of the stage theorists. Specifically, we're going to talk about Jean Piaget, a little Frenchman, and talk about language and kind of the process that we go about in developing our language skills. So let's get started. I first wanted to go ahead and review. We already did this in our cognition unit, but it's a good review because schemas are something that Piaget talks about in his stage theory. So just wanted a quick review. So remember we talked about concepts, prototypes, and schemas in the cognitive unit. So just a reminder that remember concept is kind of just like your mental image of something, and then a file in your file cabinet. And then we said a prototype is like the best, most quintessential thing that comes to mind when you think of that category. So you can think of concept as a category. A prototype is then like the best example of that category. So like I did that Family Feud game where it's like survey says. So what most people are going to think of, the first thing that comes to mind when you have that category. And then these kind of make up your schemas, which is your network of information. So a concept or framework that interprets information. So I think of it as a filing cabinet because it contains all the different folders or schemas about different things like dogs, cars, fast food restaurants, people, whatever. So let's go ahead through with an example. So remember we said schema would be a general one would be like the category of frozen desserts. So that would be one, maybe opening a whole file drawer. And then we have the different specific files that you're taking out. So more specific schemas, because remember it's like a network. So that could be custard, ice cream, gelato, Italian ice sorbet. And then even within that folder, like a specific paper, then could be like chocolate fudge brownie, Ben and Jerry's, or cookie dough, whatever. Right? So here we go, even more specific, like I said. This could be like different folders, even more specific, or like papers in those folders. So let's say if we had to do now, so these are schemas, if we had to do like a prototype of that, maybe it would be like vanilla ice cream. Or if you had to do a prototype of where to get custard, you'd automatically say like Culver's or something. But like I said before, remember those can be determined by our culture and our background. So it's definitely something that might be different for different people based on our experiences. So if you're from Wisconsin, you might think Culver's. But if you're from Vermont, where Ben and Jerry's is from, you might think Ben and Jerry's. So the two words to review here are assimilation versus accommodation. And this comes when we're learning and adding things to our schemas. So this is especially important in the developmental unit when we're talking about children developing and learning new schemas or adding on to their schemas. So one way that you could go about learning new things with your schemas would be assimilation. So this is when you interpret your new experiences in terms of your existing schemas. So your schema is kind of rigid and you're not changing your schema. You're just kind of like shoving it in there with it. So you're not adjusting what you know based on the new information that you pulled in. You're just shoving it in there and making it fit. So an example here is we're talking about like custard and ice cream. So maybe you have your schema, your child, your schema is ice cream, and then you taste Culver's custard for the first time. And then you call it ice cream and you assimilate it into your schema of ice cream. That's not correct though, right? So assimilation, you're just kind of shoving it in there with something that a schema that already exists for ice cream, but you're not making an adjustment or a new schema or changing it to say, okay, wait, this is custard, this is different. Let me update and change my schemas. So then on the other end, we have accommodation. So this is when you're actually adapting or changing your current schemas based on the new information that you're taking in. So now you learn that Culver's is custard. You're very wise, and you're going to go in and change your schema of ice cream to now kind of separate it and be like, okay, there's custard here, ice cream here. I'm adapting and changing. So you can think assimilate is shoving it in there and not changing anything, making it fit. Like when you have a puzzle piece that doesn't really fit, you're just kind of just shoving it in there, but it's not the best. Accommodation is now making that new folder or new little adjustment be like, oh, okay, yes, this makes sense. This is something different. So just like another example that Piaget gives a lot is little kids call everything doggy. So maybe you're seeing like um, a coyote or a wolf or something like that, and they're saying it's a dog, that would be assimilation. But if they say, oh, okay, wait, a wolf, coyote, this is different than a dog, this is going to be a different kind of thing. I'm going to adjust my schema. So just a reminder, again, a good review as we're heading into the AP exam, that schemas are influenced by our perceptual sets. So like I said, I gave that example of you guys drew a senior, and some people put senior in high school because that's your experiences kind of determining how you're interpreting things. If you're around old folks a lot, Shorehaven or something, you might think senior is an elderly person. Again, your perceptual set, it's your mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not the other, like the rat man illusion. If you hear a bunch of things about animals, you're going to perceive this image here as a rat. But if you hear a bunch of things about people and humans, then you're going to see it as like an old man. So again, schemas are influenced by our perceptual sets. And perceptual sets and schemas are an example of that top-down processing. So you're using your prior knowledge, experiences, memories, and schemas to interpret new information. And again, this is really fast and efficient and can be beneficial, but it also is more prone to error rather than the more time-consuming bottom-up processing. Just like we talked about heuristics versus algorithms, right? So an algorithm or a heuristic would be more top-down processing because it's really quick thing to get it done, but not the most accurate. Bottom up would be the algorithm, but it takes more time, but it's going to be right every time. So now to get started for our new stuff today. Like I said yesterday, that we talked about the two debates of nature versus nurture and continuity versus change. So this one is continuity versus stage debate. So this one's saying that basically an issue that comes up in developmental psychology is that some people think our development is continuous. So it's kind of just keep going. We just gradually kind of mature and develop over time. It's not like in different stages where, okay, in this stage here, you're going to, learn how to think abstractly, and now you move to this stage. They think it's just kind of an overall general thing. You're gradually growing and maturing more and more. Stage theorists, like we're going to talk about today with Piaget, and another famous one, which is Erikson, they think that our development is actually more abrupt and discontinuous, and it happens more in like growth spurts. So they're using growth spurts as some kind of evidence to back up this theory. So they're saying like, okay, you have infancy here. You're going to learn to potty train. You're going to do this. You're going to learn how to walk. And then once you finish that stage, boom, an abrupt change. So maybe you had like a growth spurt or, they say around the age of like 3 or something, this happens. So again, they're saying it's kind of this discontinuous stage model that's kind of like stairs. So you might have a lot of change, then you kind of stay for a little bit, then you have a lot of rapid change, and then it kind of stays pretty steady. So they're kind of the growth spurt people. Whereas continuity say that it's pretty gradual over the time. So they kind of butt heads as to which one is it more. So we're going to look at the stage theorists today, and that'll make a little bit more sense. So the two most famous stage theorists are John Piaget, and he talks about he has 4 stages of cognitive development. And then Erik Erikson has 8 stages of psychosocial development, and we're going to talk about him tomorrow. So let's get started on Jean Piaget. So he's probably the most famous child psychologist out there. So cognitive development, remember that's all about how we think, cognition. So Jean Piaget is saying that the way that we think changes over time as we mature. And this happens in stages. It's not gradual. There's a pretty stark difference in contrast between one stage versus another when you're entering and leaving it. So we have sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is sensory motor stage. So this goes from birth, when you're born, to age 2. And mainly here, right, it's called sensory motor. So you're learning to coordinate your sensory input. So touching things, right? Think of all the things that babies like to touch and put in their mouth and all that stuff. So sensory input and motor responses. You're figuring out how to coordinate your limbs. You're learning how to walk, crawl, sit up in this stage, how to hold things. So this is all that's going on in this stage. So kind of there's different things. Each stage in Piaget's has kind of an achievement that you kind of master in order to move on to the next stage. So the big achievement of sensory motor stage is that you accomplish what he calls object permanence. And this is around 6 to 8 months. So object permanence is basically, once you master that, you learn that objects still exist even when you don't see them. So prior to 6 to 8 months, if you play peekaboo with an infant, they're straight up going to think you're gone. That's why it's so fun and why they like it so much is because they just think that you disappeared, or they think that you think that they disappear when they're playing peekaboo. So they think out of sight, out of mind. So if they are playing with a little ball and it rolled under the couch, they're just like, poof, gone forever into the abyss. It's gone. So once they have at 6 to 8 months, they're going to realize, oh, like peekaboo, whatever. It's not cool anymore because I can still see, even though you're holding your hands over your face. I know you're still there. So then second stage is pre-operational stage. So this goes from 2 to 6 to 7 years old. So basically what happens here is you can't yet perform what he calls mental operations. And mental operations are basically like making predictions, making like what if scenarios. It's kind of more higher level thinking. Even something like an operation could be like math. So you can't really do those higher level thinking skills quite yet. So let's go here. Now what happens, a big achievement in this stage this is when language starts. So we're going to talk about language at the end of this lecture, but this is when language kind of acquisition occurs, which would be between 2 and 6. And then the big thing here is that during this stage, they can't quite yet grasp conservation. So conservation is this concept that things such as like mass, volume, and numbers of things remain the same despite changes in how they're set up or how they look. So basically here, I know that's kind of a funky definition, but it makes sense once you look at the pictures and you'll understand. So conservation would say, okay, look, these are 2 glasses of water. They're exactly the same and have the same amount of liquid in there. Now you're going to put it in this tall tube and in the same cup, but they're going to point and say that the tall one has more water in it, when we all know clearly it's the same, but because it's taller, she thinks that it has more in it. So they don't understand these concepts of like mass, volume, and number changing when they see that stuff. So again, toddlers and young children in this stage have not grasped that yet, so they're going to keep pointing to this one as being larger or having more water, even though they're clearly the same. So here's some other examples of things that they do that show this, whether or not you have a mastery of conservation. So for example, here, this is having to do with numbers, right? So there's checkers all lined up, but when they put the top ones, spread them out more, obviously it's the same number because we have mastered conservation, but little kids in this stage would say that the top one has more checkers in it just because it looks like they're longer and more spread out. If you guys have little siblings, maybe for extra credit or something, you can mess around with them and see if they have conservation yet. So continuing on with pre-operational stage, a couple other important things. So children in this stage are egocentric, Piaget says. So egocentric, not in the sense that they're like super duper like narcissistic, selfish, whatever, but in the sense that they can't adopt someone else's point of view. So they can't really understand how someone else would see something from where they're sitting in this scenario. So one of his tests that he does to prove this is he does the 3 mountains test. Basically, you can see here there's a table set up and 2 people are on, or the child's on one side and then like a dummy, little doll is on the other. And there's 3 mountains. So one's really tall. We have one that's medium, one that's smaller. So then this child has to draw or describe how the mountains would look from the doll's point of view. And most of the time they can't do it. They say that the doll would see what the child's seeing, so this mountain here, but they don't understand that the doll would see the small mountain. So they aren't able to quite yet understand that the doll has a different point of view than the child, than himself. So they're egocentric, again, just can't adopt another person's point of view. So for example, if your mom is in the other room and you're like, she can't see you, and then she's like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Playing with this." And he holds his toy up, assuming that the mom understands like what he's playing, but obviously he hasn't adopted her point of view to understand like, oh, she can't see it. Or sometimes little kids block the TV or just standing in front of people, just being like, whatever, because they don't realize they haven't adopted the point of view that like, oh, someone behind me can't see. So even though they're egocentric, though, they do begin to start to develop what we call a theory of mind, which is this ability to infer the thoughts and feelings of others. So they're egocentric, but they're starting to grasp this idea of being able to understand what other people are thinking or feeling. So an example, like they can understand why another kid might be mad about something or someone's like, one of their friends' emotions. So for example, maybe they're in preschool and, a little kid could think, Susie seems sad because Cole took her toy. So they can start to kind of think about how someone else is feeling. And here's another example. I like this one from the book. So we have Sally and Anne. Sally puts her ball in the red cupboard, goes away. Then Anne moves it to the blue cupboard. And then where's Sally going to look for her ball? So kids can understand, oh, even though I saw that it went in here, Sally might look in this one. So again, this is something that begins to develop. It's not fully there, but it's starting to develop in preschool age kids in this pre-operational stage. And a good way to remember pre-operational stage is you can kind of think pre-operational preschool, right? So even though 2 isn't really preschool, you can think 3 and 4. That's kind of like the prime time for preschool, pre-operational. So now we have stage 3, which is concrete operational stage. So this is where they do kind of simple logic. So they can think of like the concrete things that are here and now in front of them. So they've mastered conservation. They can understand the things that, and in front of them could be different, right? So they understand that this and this are the same. And they can think a little bit more logically and develop what's called reversibility. So here, right, they can understand 5 plus 7 is 12, and now 12 minus 7 is 5. They can do reversibility and understand that these are kind of, again, the same thing. Block D, you guys know I probably don't have the best reversibility still, considering how I was in Jeopardy when I had to do math. I was like sweating so hard that day. It was stressful. Anyway, so here, even though they can think about the concrete things like numbers and stuff right in front of them and start to read and stuff like that, they still haven't developed what's called abstract reasoning yet, which is like higher level thinking. So this happens in the formal operational stage. So concrete, I just think it gets very concrete here and now, like math has like a right or wrong answer. You can either read something correct or you don't. So it's very concrete, whereas formal operational stage is when they have abstract thinking. So this is when it's more like make a hypothesis, predict, guess, compare and contrast. So it's not stuff that has a cut and dry answer. They have to think, this is when you could start thinking about like ethics and morality and things that are really deep. So this is abstract thinking. It's things that are kind of thinking about the future. So if I was teaching like modern world history and I said, how would the world have changed if, JFK was never assassinated? That would be abstract thinking because you kind of have to really analyze and think about the future and put a lot of things together. So very deep things. So this is from age 12 onward. So he kind of says that by age 12, you kind of have developed pretty fully, cognitively at least. Right, you can always learn new things, but he says that your overall cognitive development is kind of staying here. So you're in this 12 through whenever. This is the final stage. So criticism of Piaget, right? We said that stage theorists, again, some people are like, it's not that cut and dry where you move from one stage, boom, boom, next stage. Some say it's more gradual. Others say that he underestimates the cognitive abilities of children. So he did this. This is kind of older. He's probably done this like 50 years ago. And they found that kids actually display aspects of formal operational thinking earlier than he estimated. So they think that they actually do this before adolescence. So they were saying you're underestimating the capabilities of kids actually. So they're smarter than you are putting that to be. And he also didn't have operationally defined variables. So it's hard for researchers to replicate his work, right? Because if you don't operationally define the variables and how you measure those and be specific, it's going to be hard for someone else to go ahead and replicate your study. And again, an issue, like I said, is he's kind of saying cognitive development is done at age 12, but that's a little controversial, right? I personally would think that we continue growing and we see that our prefrontal cortex, especially in adolescence, is not fully developed yet with like decision making and judgment and things like that. So, and someone like Vygotsky, who I'm going to talk about quickly next, is going to say he didn't focus enough on the sociocultural environment that a child's raised in. So Lev Vygotsky, he's my favorite. When I had to become a teacher, we had to do this whole giant EdTPA test where we wrote about teaching and blah, blah, blah forever. And I wrote about him a lot. So Lev Vygotsky, he counters Piaget, and he says that, again, you need to focus more on how culture and our social environment impacts our development. So this is in opposition to Piaget's idea of universal stages, because Piaget is saying all kids across the world are going to, hit the pre-operational stage, then they're going to go into concrete operational stage at this time. But he's saying, no, like depending on your culture and what your culture is influencing, it might be different. So not everyone's going to be the exact same timeline in these stages because of your different cultures and backgrounds and experiences. So he also suggests that children have a zone of proximal development, which he says is the zone of proximal development is what kids can do when they're scaffolded with the guidance or knowledge of someone else who's kind of good at that subject or knows more than they do. So basically, it's like group power. Two's better than one. What's the word? Two heads. My roommate here, what's the phrase? Two heads are better than one, right? Is that the phrase? That's okay. Whatever. Two heads are better than one. That's like his motto. So two wrongs don't make. I don't know if that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I'd say so. In proximal development is like two heads are better than one. So like you can accomplish more together if you're putting both your minds together than if you were just alone. So with guidance, you can accomplish more than just if you were trying to figure out something that's difficult unaided. So he again says that this is scaffolding, think like scaffolding of a building that helps support it. So with scaffolds and people, you can help be supported. So those are his things, and we use that in teaching a lot, saying that, oh, give your kids graphic organizers, give them this, you can give them scaffolds to help build them up. So then you can let them go work on their own and write their paper. So that's kind of the main stuff with Piaget, knowing his different stage theories, and then those bolded terms that I included, like theory of mind, what egocentrism is, conservation. That's all good to know. So quickly, I'm going to run through the basics of language. So language, these are kind of the three building blocks of language. You have phonemes, and these are the smallest units of sounds. So they don't have to be things that like make sense or form something, a word that we know. It's just like a unit of sound. So let's look here. We have P and B. These are phonemes because they distinguish between the word pan and ban. So phonemes are the smallest units of sound that you can use to distinguish one word from another. So the B and the P are what differentiate pan and ban. So they're a phoneme. Morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit. So it's something that carries meaning, and it could be a word or part of a word. So these are things that can't be broken down anymore. So the word boy is one morpheme because it's a meaningful unit. So we understand boy is, a young man. So it has meaning. It can't be broken down anymore. So it's one morpheme. The word boyish has two morphemes because it has boy and ish, right? Even though ish isn't a word, it has meaning to it. We understand, like if you add it to something, it means, kinda ish, right? And then the word boys has two morphemes because it's boy and s. And then the word or s has meaning even though it isn't a word because it denotes something as being plural, so it has meaning to it. And then grammar is the rules of language that allow us to communicate with one another. And semantics gives meaning, meaning to them in sentences. So grammar is, again, just the rules that we have to follow. So those are the three building blocks. And now let's get into the steps of language development. So this is kind of what we hit on in the developmental stage, right? I said that language, let's go back here. Language happens in this pre-operational stage between 2 and 6 to 7. So first you have the babbling stage, and this begins at 4 months. And again, right, it could begin relatively different times for different people, so don't take that with a grain of salt. So this is when little toddlers randomly utter things like goo goo, gaga, whatever. But it's not yet imitation of adult speech, so it doesn't make any sense, and they're not trying to copy what adults are saying. They're just kind of randomly uttering little sounds. And then we have a one-word stage, and this begins at around 1 to 2 years old. So this is when kids speak in single words like doggy. That's a big one. Mommy, daddy, whatever. And then two-word stage begins around 2 years old, so that's pretty easy to remember. And this consists of telegraphic speech. And they call it that because it's like a telegram. So this is old school. So like a telegram, it would just be, it's like very abrupt. It's not full sentences because they can't write that much. So it would be like, go car, dog go. Very simple, small speech. That's like a telegram. And then also what happens during this telegraphic stage of speech is that we have overextension. So this is when a child overextends a name for an object to more things than it actually covers. So something like doggy, right? So it should be just dogs, but they're extending it to kind of any small furry animal. It's almost like when we talk about generalization with classical conditioning. And then we have, but that's right, generalizations related to classical conditioning. Overextension is just for like language. And then we have overregularization. So this is applying a grammatical rule too widely, and then it actually creates incorrect forms. So this is like when a little kid says hitted or feets. So they're trying to apply the grammatical rules, but they're actually over regularizing them and using them incorrectly. So a famous language psychologist is Noam Chomsky, and he came up with this, or he helped support the nativist theory. So he has this idea that there's universal grammar. He really thinks that like language is innate, and we're kind of born with this internal capacity to learn a language. And he has this term called the language acquisition device, LAD. And he's basically saying it's this mental structure that everyone has that's pre-programmed with fundamental language rules. So kind of just saying we're all pre-programmed at birth to be able to have this capacity to develop language. So I talked a little bit yesterday about critical versus sensitive periods. So using the example of language is a really good one. So critical period is again, why does it say Z? So an early stage in life when an organism is especially open and available to learning something. So, but if they don't do it within this stage, then, or this period, they're not going to be able to learn it in the future. So it's kind of like do or die, now or never moment. So language, people argue that it's kind of, there's a critical period for language. So before, prior to 7 years old, you have to develop language. That's kind of the critical period. It ends at, the window ends at 7. And if after that you haven't developed your first language, then you're really not going to be able to develop that ever, or have really, really huge problems. So this big question, is developing a first language something that's under a critical period or a sensitive period? And a sensitive period is something, same kind of deal, where an organism's really open to being able to learn a particular skill or characteristic. They can learn it really rapidly during this time. But unlike the critical period, missing this won't make learning impossible. It's just going to be really, really difficult. So an interesting study in whether learning is taking, or whether language is taking place in a critical period or not, is through Jeannie, the feral child. So Jeannie is actually a feral child, so one who was kind of not raised really in like a human environment. So she was found in 1970s at the age of 13 by like Child Protective Services. And it turns out she had been locked in like an attic, strapped to a high chair, found at the age of 13. So her whole life up until 13, she was strapped to this high chair. Never exposed to language. Her dad would like bark at her and like growl at her. So she was like the most extreme kind of case of abuse or neglect ever really seen. So she had never developed a first language because of this. And she was 13 at the time. So once they found her, researchers really wanted to see if this critical period hypothesis was true. And if this is true, it's arguing that, she would never really be able to learn a language because she's 13 and she missed that window that closed at 7. So the findings were that Jeannie was able to actually learn some language, and she was able to learn a lot of words, but was never able to master grammar. So even though she had words, she could never really put them together, use those rules, and really use language correctly in a social setting. So it does give weight to that critical period hypothesis that, yeah, she did learn some language, but she really wasn't able to fully ever be able to use that in a productive manner. So it really does show that you need to get your first language developed before puberty and your brain maturing in that time. So if you guys want to watch, right, I'm trying to give you less work, but as like an enrichment thing, I know you guys find this really interesting usually. I attached a little 13-minute clip from a documentary that talks about it, so you can learn more about her. And I'll also attach like a article that talks about her too. So pretty interesting. So your homework today, just continue reading mods 50 and 52 and completing your vocab, and then work on the developmental scrapbook. So the big thing that the developmental scrapbook is assessing is if you can apply like the different stages of Piaget and like Erikson. So today we talked about Piaget. So while it's still fresh, start writing that in your developmental scrapbook is probably a good idea, and applying, how you hit the different stages of Piaget's development as a child. And then sign up for the Google Hangout tomorrow if you haven't done so. So this is going to be show and tell. You guys are going to choose a toy. I don't need that. Choose a toy and describe which stage of Piaget's theory it's in and why. So is it sensory motor, pre-operational, whatever? And then in your explanation, try to relate those bolded important concepts like object permanence, conservation. So for example, maybe my toy, I would do something like a board game that requires a lot of skill and thinking, like Catan or like something like that. So that would be something that requires more of like abstract reasoning and thinking, because you have to make predictions and think about things. It's not just concrete, it's more abstract. So show and tell. If you don't have something to show, you can just print off or like put a picture and share your screen or something. So everyone should be able to do it. All right. Looking forward to our Google Hangout tomorrow. Have a nice night.